Thank you for having me here, and thank you for funding my research. And this is actually my job market paper. Right now I'm at Haas, and afterwards I'm going to start my career at University of Toronto. So
University of what?
Toronto. Okay.
Can you speak
Yeah.
up? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So in my dissertation research, I studied the phenomenon what I'm going to call targeted search. And now, before I get into that, actually, let me motivate the study by the example, which is Pokemon Go. Okay, this is actually me with my Pikachu. Okay, now as I'm like playing the game at the street of Berkeley, I'm thinking about, okay, I need a phone case to protect my cell phone from like slippage. Okay, now how do I find a Pokemon Go case among literally thousands of different phone cases on the online platforms? Well, a standard theory would say you go to a platform, you check the listings one by one, and if you like it, you stop. But instead, if you don't like it, you just move on, right? And this is like the standard sequential search kind of framework. But the problem with that kind of approach is this is really not the way consumers search, and it's not the way that platforms want the consumer to search, right? Because the platform actually provides a number of search technologies to help consumer find a best match. Like for example, if I'm looking for this Pokemon Go case for my Galaxy Note 5, I can just type in Note 5 Pokemon case, and Amazon is going to rank all the listings by relevance, okay? Now, additionally, I can use the filters or what they call search refinement tools to further refine the search results by attributes such as material, brand, etc. Okay. Now, conceptually, this is going to make search targeted, which means in the same market, every consumer, depending on his own preference, will see a set of different listings, essentially. And that set will be specifically tailored to his own preference, okay? So in that sense, search is targeted instead of random. Now, as we can see from the table, all the major platforms, from eBay, Amazon to the Chinese Taobaos, they all use similar kind of default ranking, which is ranking by relevance to consumer search queries. And they also provide consumers with all kinds of different refinement options, okay? Now, the companies actually, they are moving further in improving these technologies. Now, here is a quote. This guy, Mike George, who's VP of Amazon, he basically said, we do a lot of work to figure out what you meant and come out with the one right answer you're looking for, okay? Now, what is he talking about? He's actually talking about their most recent artificial intelligence agent, which actually you can just talk to this Alexa and place your orders. And because Amazon knows a lot about consumers, they have consumers' home address, everything, and especially purchase history, they can use that information to make inference about consumers' preference and give consumer their very highly targeted one right answer, okay? Now, what do we know about targeted search, though? Well, there is literally thousands of papers on search. It goes all the way back to Stigler and in this particularly market that I'm interested in this horizontally differentiated market, there is this Volinsky's paper on basically the consumer sequential search in that market. Now, the vast majority of that literature focuses on different aspects of random search, right? The search is not really specifically targeted towards consumers' preference. Now, there is really nothing much about targeted search. Well, since the early 2000s or so, there are also a number of studies trying to look at what's the impact of internet on consumer search, right? And that approach typically think about the impact of internet in a high-level kind of setting, right? It's just as if it's reducing search cost. It makes search easier, right? But as you can see from this study, I'm going to actually micro model this idea of targeted search, and I'm going to show you that sometimes, yes, it has a similar effect as reducing search cost, but sometimes it's not. And that difference actually matters, especially when we move forward to the platform design questions. What are the platform's incentive in choosing a specific kind of search technology? Okay. Now, a little bit about the literature. So I'm modeling this idea of targeted search, which is related all the way back to all the search literatures. Now, there is a recent literature on provenance or ordered search that actually deviates from the standard assumption of random search. And the difference between my study and that literature is I'm going to endogenize the search order or the search sequence by making that specifically tailored to consumers' preference. Okay. Then after I build this micro model of consumer search, I'm going to combine that with the platform design model. So in that aspect, it's related to this platform design literatures. And also there is some recent papers on different search technologies' impact on the market outcomes, such as Chen Yao's paper on search refinements and Raluca's paper on the power rankings. And again, the difference, I mean, not the difference actually. Those papers actually, they typically look at, okay, so what if we change this ranking, or what if we give consumer different refinement options? What are the impact on the market outcomes? So the typical finding is what are the impact on sales, right? What is kind of missing in that empirical literature is what are the impact on prices, right? And moving further, conditional on the price is response, what are the response to in terms of platform profits and etc. So my model is going to speak to that, and my hope is that we can get more empirical studies to actually try to study the pricing implications of different search designs. Now, move into the model. It's actually a fairly standard setup. Okay, I'm going to focus on horizontally differentiated market with n sellers. Imagine n is large, some large number. Okay. Now there will be a set of consumers, and every consumer is looking for a different product. And I'm going to capture that by modeling the utility as the matched value between consumer J and product I minus the price. Okay. And to close the model, I'm going to assume the outside option is normalized to 0. Now, in terms of search setup, I'm going to use the sequential search. I'm going to assume consumer search with perfect recall and with no replacement. Okay. Now, the key setup of this model is actually how this matched values are generated. Okay. When consumers see a list of options, how is that list generated? Okay. In the standard setting of random search, that list will be randomly drawn from the whole distribution, right? So you can essentially imagine, so in the whole universe of different phone cases, those phone cases will form a distribution of values, and a consumer will just essentially randomly draw from the whole distribution, okay? Now, once we move to the world of targeted search, though, that's going to be different. How is that going to be different? Now, as a consumer, I know I'm looking for this Pokemon-related phone case, and actually, I'm going to tell the platform this is what I'm looking for. And the platform will take that piece of information, and the platform is essentially going to sort all the listings into, I'm going to actually assume they're going to sort into different buckets, essentially. Now, at first, I'm going to see this set of products, which are highly related, highly give consumers high values. And after exhausting here, maybe I can move to the next bucket, and etc. Okay. Now, why am I using this kind of setup? Well, there are a number of, from the modeling perspective, it gives me a great checkability, but it actually also has a fairly relevant kind of interpretation in terms of the actual application. Suppose you have a number of attributes, and the consumers are essentially telling the platform what kind of attribute he or she is looking for. Then you can essentially rank all the product by how many of the attribute fit consumer's description, right? And that's going to actually give you a discrete sets of products depending on how many attributes fit consumer's description, right? So the first set will be the product that fits all the consumer's descriptions or search queries, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, this value here, the value of the highest cutoff, is going to be a key parameter of this model. I'm going to call that precision of the model, of the search technology. Now, why is that precision? Well, if the search is highly precise, if the platform is able to provide consumer with almost exactly what they're looking for, then this cutoff should be high. It should be close to the upper bound of this value distribution, right? Now, on the other hand, if you are using a quite primitive kind of platform, such as Craigslist, right? There's really nothing much you can do on Craigslist. Then this cutoff will be actually quite low, and if you move that cutoff all the way back to the lower bound, then we are essentially back to the random search kind of framework. Okay, so this single parameter gets to the idea of different precision of targeted search. Okay, now the timing of the game is fairly standard. The platform essentially announce this or chooses this precision, and the market participant would enter the market, and market will clear simultaneously. Now, in solving the model, I essentially go backwards. I first try to solve for the consumer's optimal search strategy or their stopping rules, and I'm going to use that to derive at the demand functions and use the demand to solve for the equilibrium price. And building on that whole equilibrium, I'm going to solve for the platform's optimal design problem of different. Essentially, the platform is choosing the X, right? So I'm going to solve for that. Okay. Now, in terms of the consumer search strategy, we know that in the case of random search, they are going to use a fairly standard or fairly simple stopping rule. Consumers search until they find a matched value that's equal to or greater than this reservation utility, right? And which is defined by making the marginal benefit of search equals to the marginal cost of search. So moving to targeted search, the only difference here is actually the value distribution is different, right? Before it's a whole distribution of all the different listings. Now essentially it's a truncated one or a conditional one. Okay. Now, there is a little bit of caveat. It's because once you set it up like this solution may not exist, and it turns out the boundary where it barely exists is an important parameter of this model, which I'm going to call that X star. We'll see how that works in a minute. Okay. Now, building on this consumer search strategy, we can actually easily use that to get to the demand function, and the demand it has the usual two parts. If you compare that with the original Volitsky model, it has the same two parts of flash demand, which is the probability that the consumer is going to stop immediately, plus the recall demand is the demand that consumer is going to exhaust all the options and recall this listing. Okay. Now we can integrate that over the distribution of sellers, and we can get the total demand. So first, I'm going to prove that the equilibrium actually exists when this number of sellers is large enough. Now, the interesting question though is how is price going to change, right? As we change this X or the precision of search. Now, intuitively, when you increase this X, or when you make the listings more and more targeted, when consumers are getting better and better matches, would price tend to increase or decrease? Well, it seems like it should increase because when consumers are getting better match, right, sellers should be able to charge them more. It turned out to be actually not the case. Why? Because there is another effect, which is price is actually not determined by how much of a good match consumers are getting. Instead, price is determined by the competition between sellers, right? And essentially, sellers can have a margin because there is a search friction, which leads to less than perfect competition. And that kind of computation is actually going to be stronger when you make a search more and more precise, right? Because in this setup, when you increase this precision of a search, all the remaining listings that are like above this cutoff X, they are going to be more and more similar to each other, right? And that force is going to essentially make it easier for consumer to navigate and to and that it's going to make the demand more elastic. Okay. Now, okay, that's actually the first half of the story. Okay, so I can show that when this X is smaller than the cutoff, I'm going to talk about why what is that cutoff actually. When this precision is below that cutoff, targeted search act almost the same way as reducing search cost, right? It makes this market more competitive, and it's going to decrease the price. Now, when this X is above this cutoff, though, the story is very different. Now, why is that? Because when you push this search precision higher and higher, when it's closer and closer to the upper bound, there will be a turning point beyond which consumer visit at most one seller, right? Because all the remaining sellers are so similar to each other that such that their difference cannot compensate consumer's search cost. Now, so in that case, every seller would actually become a monopoly. And then we are going to get a high price, and that price is going to increase in this precision of search. And I'm going to make two comments about this paper, about this result. The first is that it's not a diamond result, but although it looks like it, because it has this sellers has the monopoly power, it's not because it's not really a knife edge kind of case in which you have an infinite small search cost would lead to the monopoly price. The result is actually there because the search cost is not really infinite small, right? It has some substantial search cost. And the other comment is fairly obvious. Now, this effect is actually the opposite of reducing search cost. So to put both pieces together, this is a graph. It shows how this price, which is the blue line, is changing as I change this precision of search. Right? So when I increase this search precision, when consumers are getting better matches, at first price goes down. Okay. And also you can see this reservation utility goes up, so it means consumers are more demanding. They're demanding a better fit to stop the search process. Now, if you're interested in consumer welfare, it's actually the difference between the two lines, the reservation utility minus price. So on this region, consumers are getting a lot of surplus from improved search technology. It comes from three sources, essentially. One is consumers are on average getting a better match, and they visit less, so they are paying less of search cost. And also the price is lower. So all three contribute to consumer welfare. Now, but once you pass the cutoff here, and this cutoff is where consumers are just, so if the precision is below this cutoff, consumers are making just barely more than one visit versus exactly one visit, then the price suddenly goes up and is going to increase with the X. Now this particular discontinuous jump here, it exists because I assume essentially consumers are homogeneous in they are having the same search cost, they are searching with the same precision, right? Now, if I allow any of the heterogeneity, I won't have this discontinuity. Instead, I'm going to have a smoother kind of transition from price decreasing to price increasing. Okay. Now, move a little bit further to the platform design questions. I'm going to assume the platform are making money essentially out of two ways, or two possible ways. One possible way is they are charging a commission. The other way is they can sell the promoted slots at advertising agency kind of model. Now, in the commission model, it's fairly straightforward to set up. So I'm going to assume this platform is charging a commission rate Z. It's act as if as a tax. Now, as you can imagine, when this precision increases, at first, the platform actually wants to increase the commission rate because this improved search technology gives consumer a lot of surplus, and the platform wants to extract those surplus by charging a higher commission rate, and which would lead to a higher market price. Okay. Now, that there is actually, there is a limit to that, because if the platform increase the search precision too much beyond this limit, then price might be too high. So, which may not be optimal for the platform actually, even though the platform is also charging a very high commission rate. Now, so the intuition is, again, goes back to how the price is changing with the search precision. Okay. So by encouraging by actually making the search not so perfect, the platform can regulate the price by encouraging price competition between the sellers. Okay. Now, the other model that I considered is the probability slot model, which is something like this. So this is a screenshot of Amazon. The first two listings are marked by sponsored, which essentially means they are probability slots. The sellers can bid for those slots. Now, I'm going to set up the model, basically assuming this platform is going to choose a set of the slots, and they will be sold through some efficient mechanism, such as second price auctions. And sellers would bid for the slots, and consumer would enter with the market would clear. Okay. Now, one immediate implication when I apply this model to the targeted search model is that only relevant sellers would want to get those slots because they are going to be the highest bidders, essentially. Now, the revenue implication of this model is that it's actually fairly similar. So when this platform is making the search more and more targeted, then the first 2 or 3 slots would be extremely valuable to consumers because they are going to be also more and more targeted. So their market share is going to increase. Okay. Now, which means that the platform can charge more, or the sellers are willing to bid more for the same slots. Okay. Now, again, that has a limit because if the precision is too high, then we are in the monopoly region in which price will be too high and not many consumers would enter the market, and that would also lead to possibly decrease in the revenue of selling those slots. So, so basically to summarize, I built a molecular model of targeted search, and I'm basically showing that a more precise search is not always the same as reducing search cost. It sometimes is the same, but if it's too precise, it can actually be almost the opposite. Okay. Now, in terms of the platform's decision, though, this would lead to an immediate implication in terms of platform design. When the platform is deciding how many search options should I give to consumers, or how should I optimize my search algorithm to take into consumers' personalized data to make the recommendations, essentially. They have to think about there's implications, right? So in terms of the Amazon's Alexa, so actually I got one of those. It's actually quite affordable. You can buy Alexa Echo Dot. I think it's $49, something like that, which is quite interesting. You can just talk to it and place orders. Now, as it's designed right now, if you talk to Alexa, Alexa would give you one right answer that the Amazon thinks which is best for you. Okay. Now, the implication of that model, of that kind of way of searching, is that as a seller of that one right answer, I would have enormous incentive to jack up my price. Right? I want to charge more and more price if I know I'm the only option that's going to present to consumers. Right? Now, so that may not be optimal for the platform, and there are a number of ways the platform can do to counter that, but such as giving consumers 2 options instead of 1. Like that's actually enough to make sure there is price competition. Right? And there is some more stuff to it, but I'll just leave it at here and wait for my discussion. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Our discussant is Maher Said from Stern School of Business, NYU.
Great. So thank you very much for having me. This is a great paper to discuss. I really enjoyed reading it. And as you'll see, one of the reasons I think it was really interesting was because in some ways it's actually quite counterintuitive result. And I had to sort of think a little bit about why my intuition was wrong. And that's always sort of, I think, one of the nice things to see in a paper is that it makes you actually think about things. So just briefly to quickly summarize the paper, basic question is, how does filtering or targeting influence competition in search markets? And in particular, once we understand how it influences competition, well, what does that mean that a platform that's providing a search market should do? Should they be charging for refinement? How much refinement should they allow? That sort of a thing. And so the approach is to basically augment Walensky's sort of classic paper on consumer search and add this sort of search refinement aspect to it. Essentially say, what happens if we can guarantee that consumers are going to see high quality matches first? So it's not really pure random search, but it's somewhat directed. And we're going to use this, we're going to derive the symmetric equilibrium, use that to characterize the various objects that we care about. And the basic punchline is twofold. One is this conclusion that prices are non-monotone in the precision of this refinement, or the ability to target. So as we go from a sort of pure random search world to one in which there is some targeting, there's a decrease in prices, and then there's sort of a jump up and prices start increasing. And this has sort of interesting implications for what a platform should be doing in terms of how much targeting they should be allowing, how to extract some of the surplus that they may be able to create using this sort of targeting. So again, the basic model, you've got the seller who's choosing prices, or sellers rather. All the sellers are basically identical. They're ex-ante identical from the perspective of consumers, so they're IID draws. And so this buyer is basically searching around looking for the best match. And the key innovation here is this idea of the targeting, that there's this threshold, that the platform has the ability to commit to saying, if there are matches that have a value greater than some level X, I'm going to show you those matches first. And the focus in the paper is on the symmetric equilibrium where everybody is charging identical prices. And the reason it makes sense to think of everybody charging identical prices is precisely because everybody is ex-ante identical. If we don't know precisely what the consumer is looking for, whether they're looking for a Pokemon phone case or a Dragon Ball Z phone case, I'm selling one of these or the other one of them, I don't know what consumers are looking for, well then I may or may not be one of the people that's up at the top, one of these sort of high value people, and so it makes sense for me to do something symmetric. And so the basic punchline, or the basic sort of driving motivation rather, comes out of this sort of search behavior. So in the classic world, you've got this idea that buyers are going to continue to search as long as the marginal benefit of searching is greater than the marginal cost. And that basically means we're going to do this sort of reservation style threshold. If I see something that's above that threshold, I'm going to stop, I'm going to buy it immediately. I can do that because everybody's prices are the same, so really all I care about is the match quality. And I'm going to do that as long as this continuing to search is better for me than stopping. When we introduce this targeting, the one thing that changes is the distribution of things that I see. I now see things that are coming from this sort of truncated from below distribution, and what that means is that the benefit of search improves. Because now I'm guaranteed to only see, with each additional search, high quality objects. Things that are matched, are more precisely matched to me. And what this boils down to is, again, we have the same sort of cutoff strategy, and there's going to be two subcases. The first case, I've written as W is bigger than X. This is, I guess, the case of X is less than X star in Zach's notation. That's where search is providing additional value above and beyond that sort of initial targeting. In the reverse case, that's where search is sort of too expensive. So you can think of this second case basically as saying, I'm seeing something, guaranteed to see something that's already so good, so close to sort of the upper bound of the possible range of values, that there's really no benefit whatsoever to expending any additional cost and continuing to search. And so the pricing is going to depend very much on which of these two regimes we're in. And so the intuition for the first regime is that we have this sort of better distribution. we've truncated, we've gotten rid of all the terrible stuff. And that means that there's going to be more search behavior, because I know that when I search again, I'm going to see good objects. But if I'm going to be searching more and more frequently, that means that my demand is more elastic. And if my demand is more elastic, that means prices are going to have to be pushed down. In the flip side case, consumers are only going to see great matches from the beginning. And so what that means is that they're not going to bother searching. And so that means that the seller has essentially local monopoly power. The first person I see, I'm going to be buying from them, and therefore they can jack up their prices. And again, in equilibrium, everybody's happy to jack up their prices because everybody has an equal chance of being that first person that I see. And this takes us into then platform design issues, and essentially we understand now, prices are changing as we change the level of targeting. And so what does the platform do to, how much targeting does the platform want to do? And they're going to trade off these issues of basically trying to extract these rents. And the basic punchline, or I think the most interesting aspect of those results, are the results where we look at a world where the sort of size of the market is increasing in the consumer surplus that's being provided to the consumers. The idea being that if the gap between expected values and prices is getting bigger, then more buyers are going to enter into this market, and that's going to sort of moderate some of the rent extraction motive, because we have the sort of classic volume versus margin trade-off. There's also this stuff on promoted slots and these sort of like sponsored links in some sense, and this idea of that one way we can capitalize on this search technology or this targeting technology is offering the sale of these sort of prominent positions. And this is, by the way, reminiscent in some sense of there's a nice paper by Susan Athey and Glenn Ellison that has a sort of similar feel to this with the sort of endogenous search behavior. So overall, I think this is a really nice paper. It's a nice piece of applied theory. I think it's an interesting question, very simple, elegant setting. There's some work in the paper itself that wasn't presented that shows that the predictions are somewhat consistent with some empirical evidence. And I say somewhat because I'm not an empiricist, and so I'm going to caveat my analysis of that portion and say it looks good to me, but take that with a very big grain of salt. But again, like I said earlier, the really neat thing about this paper is that it's counterintuitive. And so let me tell you what my original intuition was, and that maybe will help, I think, drive a little bit of an understanding of what's going on in this paper. So my initial intuition about what happens as we increase the precision of targeting was that increasing this threshold improves match quality. And improved match quality is good because that means people have a higher willingness to pay. If I know I'm getting a good object, I'm going to be willing to pay more. Similarly, you'd think, well, if we're improving match quality, that means it's sort of a thinner market. There's less there's less sellers out there that any one seller is in competition with, because there's not really that many people that have high sort of match or high quality matches with this consumer. And you put these two forces together, less competition, higher willingness to pay, that should give us higher prices, which is precisely the opposite of what actually happens. This intuition is wrong. And the reason this intuition is wrong is because the idea of what's happening in search, that this better match quality is actually increasing the returns to continued search, and it's driving an increase in the elasticity of demand. And the key thing that's driving that in this paper is that this high quality market remains thick. Ultimately, the focus is on the limit behavior as the number of sellers grows large. And what that means is that we're looking at a world where, even conditional on being above that high threshold, where there's fewer than the sort of sum total of all the buyers or sellers on the market, there's still going to be a lot of them. And so there still is this incentive to search. It's not like a world where there's 3 sellers and I see one that's really good and I know it's really, really unlikely that either of the other 2 are going to be good. So my original intuition, though, is a little bit better for the case where searching sort of gets shut down, where the first person I see is essentially a monopolist. Because there, that match quality is sufficiently high to decrease demand and decrease search behavior, and you do get that higher price. But again, here, that higher price is in part also being driven by the fact that we're looking at an equilibrium in the limit as n is going to infinity. And what that's doing is that means that each firm is pricing high because they think that there's a reasonable chance that they may well be that sort of highest bidder, and that if everybody else, and that in some sense that the only way I'll ever make a sale is if I am that very first highest quality guy. So as far as going forward with the platform design aspects, I really liked the approach of linking demand to consumer surplus, and I think that's something that's, I think, a really interesting way to push this forward. And it raises the natural question of seller incentives as well. So if the search targeting is changing the prices that firms are going to be offering in equilibrium, presumably that's also influencing their profits. And you might think that there's an interesting trade-off there in terms of creating market thickness on the other side. I might want to play with my commission rates, or I might want to play with the different policies I have in order to increase participation on the other side of the market. And so I think it's a sort of natural step, and that pushes towards this direction of thinking about platform competition. And so there's not a lot of work. So Hannah has a really nice paper that's coming out in Management Science. There's a nice paper by Glenn Ellison and Drew Fudenberg. There's not really much in this area of platform competition, especially in a context where firms are choosing prices and consumers are searching over firms and thinking about these trade-offs. So there's a lot of open questions there. Some more comments, but I'm out of time, and I'm happy to talk about these offline. I think I should yield the floor. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this paper.
First of all, thank you, Mark, for your wonderful discussion. I really like it. I especially want to actually talk a little bit about these other comments. So the first point is really a really good point, because essentially, when I'm talking about different search technology, price is not one of the factors that actually determine the sequence of search. And it actually can be, and it is actually, in the real life settings, when Amazon is choosing which is the most relevant product, price is one of the factors that determines that. Now, this is actually one of my extensions that I've been thinking about. Now, essentially, it falls back into two cases. Now, one, if price matters a lot in terms of if the two items are ex ante the same, but one with the higher price will always be displayed like later, then that's going to essentially lead to a bourgeois competition, which is going to drive price all the way down to marginal cost. Now, on the other hand, if price matters not so much in the sense that the one with the lower price has a higher chance of getting displayed higher, which to me seems like a reasonable setting, then that's essentially going to drive price all the way down, but the non-monotonicity can survive. So yeah, so that would be my first response to that. And I really like the second one about this, thinking more about essentially the shape of the distribution. So the way of cutting the distribution is one. I mean, it's one simple way to manipulate the difference between targeted search versus random search, but it's not the only way, right? There is a number of ways we can do it. Actually, we can essentially generate another distribution out of the original, right? Then there is a lot more interesting questions we can ask, like what about the location of the distribution versus the spread? Or like how would that affect the prices, etc. So then we can give a lot more space of design, so to speak, to the platform, which is a wonderful idea. I'm being excited to explore. Yeah.